They weren't snipers. They weren't spies. They were artists, armed with paintbrushes, inflatable tanks, and a talent for illusion. But in the shadows of World War II, they became one of the Allies' most powerful weapons. This is the true story of the Ghost Army, a top-secret U.S. military unit made up of actors, sound engineers, set designers, and painters, whose mission was to lie convincingly enough to save lives. And they did. With rubber tanks, fake radio chatter, and battlefield sound effects played from hidden trucks, they fooled German forces into chasing shadows. The real soldiers slipped by unnoticed. Thousands of lives were spared, not through firepower, but through deception. For decades, the world never knew they existed. Their operations were buried in classified files, their names unspoken, even in their own homes. Until now. Join Detective Blue as we uncover how a group of creatives became wartime illusionists. Why were they erased from history for so long? And what finally brought their secrets into the light? Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who never fired a single shot. In the darkness of war, when the world had turned to ash and fire, a different kind of weapon was forged, not of steel or gunpowder, but of illusion, brushstrokes, and sound. They were painters, sculptors, actors, and sound engineers. They were men who once dreamed of Broadway stages and gallery walls, of light and laughter, and the human form in charcoal. Instead, they were cloaked in olive drab, whispering secrets into radios that never reached their true destinations. This was the Ghost Army. It was 1944 when Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Ingersoll, along with Colonel Billy Harris, envisioned a covert force designed not to fight, but to deceive. With the full backing of the U.S. Army and under absolute secrecy, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was formed. It was the most unlikely unit of the war, an army of artists tasked with fooling Hitler's Wehrmacht. The men who joined were recruited not for their combat prowess, but for their ability to create. They came from art schools like Pratt and Cooper Union, some barely out of college, others already establishing themselves in the booming cultural scenes of New York and Chicago. Among them was fashion designer Bill Blass, photographer Art Kane, and painter Ellsworth Kelly, names that would one day be revered in peacetime, but who now shouldered a new duty: mislead the enemy at all costs. Their first missions were like sketches, rough, experimental, filled with mistakes and lessons. But as the months progressed, they grew bolder and their craft sharper. They used inflatable rubber tanks, so realistic from a distance they could fool enemy reconnaissance. These decoys were lightweight but imposing, strategically placed in open fields with carefully disturbed earth to suggest treads and movement. They painted camouflage on them, studied how real battalions set up camp, and mirrored those patterns down to the last truck tire. Sound engineers lugged enormous wire recorders across European mud and forest, playing pre-recorded battlefield noises through massive speakers mounted on jeeps. The grumble of engines, the shout of men, the metallic clang of tank treads, they were all stitched together into a believable auditory lie that could be heard up to 15 miles away. Sometimes, the Ghost Army's most vital weapon wasn't a decoy tank or a fake message, it was a voice. The carefully timed radio transmissions, sent by skilled impersonators, convinced the German high command that entire divisions were stationed where there were none. Their mission was never just tactical, it was profoundly human. Each operation might draw enemy artillery away from real soldiers. Each successful lie could mean fewer real American boys dying in the hedgerows and woods. But the emotional toll was real. The Ghost Army carried rifles, but they were not meant to use them. They moved in the shadows, dressed up reality, and sold the enemy dreams. They lived in perpetual tension, constantly one misstep away from being discovered and destroyed. Yet they pressed on, not for glory, not for medals, but for the thousands of lives that hung in the balance of their charade. In March 1945, the unit found themselves near Krefeld, Germany. By then, the war was turning, but every victory came with heavy cost. The Germans were desperate, and every mistake by Allied forces could mean delay or disaster. Operation Fearsinn was to be one of their boldest missions. Their objective: make the Germans believe the U.S. 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were preparing to cross the Rhine at a fake location drawing German defenses away from the real crossing point miles to the south. The Ghost Army rolled out hundreds of rubber Shermans and field artillery units. Canvas tents were pitched in organized rows, tire tracks laid by hand across muddy roads. Giant speakers played the churn of tanks, the banter of soldiers, the clatter of mobile kitchens. Radio operators assumed the identities of actual battalion signal corpsmen, transmitting in carefully scripted patterns. And it worked. The Germans, relying on aerial reconnaissance and intercepted signals, were convinced. They reinforced the fake location, delaying their reaction to the actual crossing. Thousands of Allied troops crossed the Rhine with significantly less resistance, thanks to an army that never truly existed. The victory came at a cost. Not all Ghost soldiers made it home. Some were captured during risky deployments. Others lived with the haunting knowledge that they couldn't tell anyone, not family, not wives, not even fellow soldiers, what they had truly done. Their mission was a secret wrapped in silence, and the burden of that silence weighed heavily. The strange paradox of their service gnawed at them. They had risked their lives to save others, but they could never speak of it. There were no medals, no recognition. When they returned home, they faded into civilian life. Some went back to their canvases, their fashion houses, their film sets. Others drifted into obscurity, carrying memories of phantom tanks and soundstage battlefields tucked deep within their minds. But in the cold nights after the war, when no one else was listening, some of them would sit with old photographs and sketches of rubber tanks that looked real enough to kill, of tents that never held a soldier, of speaker wires tangled like veins across frozen ground. They'd remember the thrill of pulling off a perfect illusion, the fear of being discovered, and the quiet pride that somehow they had saved lives with nothing but art, trickery, and daring. Their war had been one of shadows and whispers, but the truth, like the best illusions, was powerful enough to shift the course of history. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the Ghost Army's illusions became more intricate, more dangerous. The closer the Allies pushed toward Berlin, the more vital deception became, and the more reckless it sometimes felt. But by now, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had learned how to dance with danger, wearing masks made of smoke and mirrors, betting lives on the perfection of a painted shadow. By April, they'd completed over 20 large-scale deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. Each new mission built on the last, more refined, more daring. But with success came a silent dread. Every member of the Ghost Army knew that their luck might run out, and that when it did, their rifles and sidearms wouldn't stop a real tank or a hail of German gunfire. Private Sam Ross, a muralist from Brooklyn, had once painted scenes of Coney Island boardwalks and jazz clubs. Now, he spent nights bent over maps by candlelight, helping design fake campsites and troop movements. He used chalk, charcoal, and greased pencils to sketch strategic lies. But the hardest part wasn't the artistry. It was knowing that a wrong stroke could send real men to their deaths. Sam shared a tent with Corporal James "Jimmy" Dawson, a voice actor before the war. Jimmy was the kind of man who could mimic a colonel's tone or a private Southern drawl, transmitting radio messages that fooled even American officers. Their tent was filled with sketches, empty coffee mugs, and the constant static of a shortwave receiver. One night in a Belgian forest during Operation Brest, Jimmy stood outside, watching fog creep through the trees. Sam joined him, wrapped in his coat, the bitter cold biting through the fabric. They watched headlights flicker through the woods, just trucks repositioning fake tanks. But the tension never left. "Ever think about what happens if this all goes to hell?" Jimmy asked quietly. "All the time," Sam replied. "But I also think about how many didn't die at the Rhine because of what we did." Jimmy nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? We spend our days lying, and yet somehow we're the ones saving lives." That contradiction haunted them all. They were heroes by deception, warriors who didn't shoot, men whose battles were fought with ink, sound, and illusion. But they still bled. They still feared. They still buried friends. During Operation Koblenz, a near disaster underscored the danger of their craft. A German reconnaissance plane spotted a rubber tank with its side deflated in the early morning mist. The team scrambled to reinflate it and reposition nearby decoys. The deception was nearly blown. Sam remembered diving behind a hedgerow, heart hammering, as German mortars rained down, too close for comfort. One of their sound engineers, Sergeant Leo Marks, was injured when shrapnel tore through his leg. He was evacuated in silence, never speaking about his role. Their orders were always clear. If captured, say nothing. Their very existence was classified. If a ghost army soldier were taken by the enemy, no rescue would come. Their identities were ghosts in the military ledger, protected only by their silence. But the weight of silence extended far beyond the battlefield. Letters home were carefully worded, still doing work behind the lines. Many wrote, keeping busy, hope to be home soon. Wives and mothers believed they were clerks, radio repairmen, truck drivers. No one could know they were actors in a war-sized performance, staging the greatest show Earth had ever seen. At night, in empty barns and ruined castles, the artists would sometimes draw. They sketched their tents, their illusions, each other. They painted the landscapes they passed, the French children watching from fences, the wreckage of cities. They etched sorrow into the pages of notebooks that would never see publication. But they also laughed, loud, defiant laughter. In a world ripped apart by death and cruelty, they found humor in their absurd mission. They named their inflatable tanks, O.L. Betsy, the Duke, Big Bertha. They painted pin-up girls on the side of rubber jeeps. They staged mock battles, complete with fake gunfire and shouted commands, even when no enemy was watching, just to practice their timing. And always they moved. After every operation, they vanished into the night like phantoms, leaving behind only footprints and false evidence. The Germans chased ghosts, and the real army advanced unhindered. By May 1945, whispers of Germany's collapse spread like wildfire through the Allied lines. In towns and fields across Europe, people began to hope. The end was near. For the Ghost Army, the final missions carried a heavy finality. One operation near the Elbe River involved creating an entire Phantom division to support a real bridge crossing. The deception worked, and Allied casualties were minimal. But that night, as fireworks from the real battle lit up the sky, Sam stood alone, watching the burning horizon. The war was ending. The lies were no longer needed. But instead of celebration, he felt hollow. What would they be without the war? Would anyone believe what they had done? Would anyone even know? When Germany surrendered days later, there was no grand parade for the Ghost Army. They received no medals, no honors, not even official acknowledgement. They packed their illusions into crates and left quietly, one last disappearing act. Back in the States, the men faded into civilian life. Sam returned to New York and opened a modest studio. Jimmy became a radio announcer, his voice once again entertaining rather than deceiving. They never spoke of the war, not even to each other, not even when their paths crossed in silent nods at gallery openings or train stations. The memories were locked away, secret, sacred, buried under decades of ordinary life. The truth of what they had done and the lives they had saved lived only in them. But truth, like art, has a way of surviving time. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories, of fading scars into silence. But for the men of the Ghost Army, the silence had always been part of the mission. After the war ended, they returned to a country eager for peace and normalcy. The parades were for the infantry, the medals pinned to the chests of generals and gunners. For the artists and deceivers, there were no salutes, no thank yous. Their war had vanished as quietly as it had been waged. Sam Ross kept a box beneath his bed, a worn shoebox filled with sketches from the war. There were quick pencil lines of inflatable tanks and false campsites, charcoal outlines of battlefields that never truly existed, and portraits of friends he hadn't seen in years. Some had passed on. Others were scattered across the country, living quiet lives. Sam rarely opened the box. When he did, it was always at night alone, the memories creeping in like old ghosts. He had told his wife only that he'd been part of a special operations unit. She never pressed. Perhaps she knew not to. There were things he couldn't say, not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't allowed. Their mission had been classified for decades. For nearly 50 years, the full truth of the Ghost Army remained buried in government archives. Jimmy Dawson had passed away in 1996. His obituary said little about his war record, only that he'd served in Europe. Sam read it in the paper, sitting at his kitchen table. He remembered Jimmy's voice echoing through the Belgian woods, perfectly mimicking a general's cadence. He remembered their long conversations under canvas tents and the laughter that kept them sane. He placed the newspaper clipping in the box under his bed and closed it once more. But history has a pulse, and even secrets, when they beat loud enough, eventually find light. In the early 2000s, a historian named Rick Baer uncovered details about the Ghost Army's existence and began compiling stories from surviving veterans. Word spread slowly, through documentaries, through books, through whispers finally given breath. Men who had stayed silent for half a century began to speak, not for glory, but because they finally could. Sam was in his late 80s when he was interviewed for a public broadcast special. His hands trembled as he showed the interviewer his sketches, the rubber tanks, the sound trucks, the speaker towers disguised as hedgerows. "Do you feel proud of what you did?" the interviewer asked. Sam paused, eyes misting. "We didn't fight with bullets," he said. "But every time we tricked the Germans, every time we pulled off a mission, it meant someone else didn't have to die. That was our fight. We just used different weapons." Recognition came slowly, but it came. The Department of Defense declassified the Ghost Army's missions. Veterans organizations began to speak their names. They were invited to speak at military academies, where cadets once trained only in warfare now study deception, strategy, and psychological operations as part of modern military doctrine. But the most profound moment came in March 2024, almost 80 years after their first mission, when Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. Sam, now 99, was wheeled into the Capitol Rotunda, where the ceremony was held. There were only a few surviving members left, their bodies frail, their eyes still alert. The medal was heavy in his lap, engraved with images of inflatable tanks, loudspeakers, and radio waves. Below the symbols, a single phrase was carved: "In deception, courage. In silence, sacrifice." As the national anthem played, Sam closed his eyes. The faces of his old friends filled his mind: Jimmy's smirk, Leo's quiet focus, the young draftsman who never made it home. He imagined them standing beside him, invisible but real. In that moment, it wasn't about honor. It wasn't about medals. It was about truth. The truth that what they had done mattered. That saving lives with trickery was just as brave as facing bullets. That illusion had been their armor, and artistry their ammunition. After the ceremony, a young girl approached Sam. She was no older than 10, holding a sketchpad in her hand. "My teacher told us about you," she said shyly. "I want to be an artist too. Maybe not in a war, but like you." Sam smiled, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the edge of her sketchpad. "Then you're already halfway there," he said. "Never forget, what we create can change the world, even in its darkest moments." Back in his small apartment that night, Sam sat at his desk. For the first time in decades, he opened the box beneath his bed, not to mourn, but to share. He pinned the old drawings to the wall. He labeled each with dates, names, and missions. He wrote letters to the families of men who never got to tell their stories. He began to draw again, not illusions of war, but memories. Laughter around a campfire, the wind moving through fake canvas tanks, the look on a young soldier's face when he realized they had survived because of a lie. The Ghost Army never sought applause. Their reward had always been the lives they saved and the knowledge that they had turned art into a shield. But in those final years, they were no longer invisible. They had stepped into the light, not just as soldiers, but as a living testament that courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, but a brush, a voice, and a vision. Sam passed away a few months later, peacefully, with his children by his side and his sketches on the walls around him. His story, like those of so many others, had finally been told, and the world remembered.